Welcome, dear viewers. Today I invite you on a journey through time to the chilly mists of the English winter of 1847, where we'll meet Charlotte Pemberton, a young woman whose destiny was charted by injustice but rewritten by courage. Amid the gilded halls and stone-cold hearts of Victorian society, we'll discover that true nobility lies not in titles, but in the dignity with which we face life's storms. It is a story where true love blossoms not in the perfumed gardens of privilege, but in the arid soil of exile and redemption. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching us from? Leave your city in the comments. That wonderful energy fuels our stories. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give us a like. It warms our hearts as much as a fireplace on a winter's night. Bath, England, winter of 1847. The fog danced through the gardens of Thornfield Manor like ghosts whispering ancient secrets. Charlotte Pemberton adjusted the wool shawl over her delicate shoulders, watching through the main parlor window as the first raindrops began to mark the glass with silver tears. At 19, she possessed the melancholic beauty of an orphan, raised among luxuries that never truly belonged to her, brown hair that caught the golden candlelight, green eyes that seemed to hold the depth of ancient forests, and a posture that blended natural grace with the caution of someone who learned early to walk on unstable ground. Duchess, her golden-furred spaniel companion, rested at her feet, her silky ears drooping like velvet curtains. The animal seemed to sense the tension that hung in the air on that December night, when the wind howled through the chimneys like a premonition. Charlotte, Lady Beatrice Thornfield's voice cut through the silence like a blade of ice. Her sister-in-law approached with measured steps, her patent leather shoes echoing on the marble with ruthless authority. At 40, Lady Beatrice personified Victorian rigidity, a tightly laced corset, hair pulled into a severe bun, and a gaze that seemed capable of freezing roses in full bloom. Charlotte turned slowly, her hands clasped together like wounded birds seeking shelter. The paper Lady Beatrice held trembled slightly in the draught from the half-open window. "This letter arrived this morning." The older woman's voice held a chill that made the winter seem warm. "Signed by an anonymous witness, who prefers to remain so but whose word I cannot ignore." Charlotte's heart began to pound like the hooves of a fleeing horse. She knew the weight of unspoken words, the gravity of the silences that precede storms. Duchess lifted her head, her brown eyes fixed on the young woman's face. "What does the letter say, Lady Beatrice?" "That you were seen in an improper rendezvous with the gardener in secret, in the back pavilion." Each word fell like a stone into a deep lake, creating ripples of devastation. "That 3 weeks ago, when you claimed to be unwell for tea with the Whitmores, you were in fact compromising this family's honor." Charlotte's world collapsed like a house of cards in a gale. She opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. How could she defend herself against an accusation she had never dreamed possible? Her meetings with Thomas, the gardener, had amounted to brief conversations about the roses he cultivated with such care, innocent moments where she sought relief from the stifling atmosphere of the manor. "I would never, Lady Beatrice, this is a cruel lie." "A lie?" Lady Beatrice's eyes gleamed like shards of ice in the candlelight. "The reputation of this house cannot be stained by suspicions, even if unfounded. You will depart tomorrow at dawn for the staff cottage, until this situation is completely clarified. But the engagement to Henry, Lord Blackwood has been informed. The engagement is broken." The words hit Charlotte like a barrage of arrows. Henry Blackwood, the young viscount she was meant to marry in the spring, had not hesitated to abandon her at the first rumor. The love she thought she saw in his blue eyes proved as fragile as morning frost. "Please allow me to speak with him, to explain." "There is nothing to explain. Pack only what you need. Duchess may accompany you." Lady Beatrice withdrew like a passing storm, leaving only the echo of her footsteps and the bitter scent of injustice. Charlotte sank into the velvet armchair, her hands trembling like autumn leaves. Duchess climbed onto her lap, offering the only comfort available on that winter night that had become the start of her exile. Through the window, the rain intensified, washing the gardens like tears from the sky itself. And Charlotte understood that her life as she knew it had ended with the silent cruelty of an anonymous letter and the cowardice of a love that had never been true. But neither she nor Duchess imagined that, in the heart of the approaching storm, seeds of a truer happiness were already beginning to germinate. The staff cottage stood like a lonely island among the bare winter trees, its stone walls damp from the constant fog that hugged Bath like a glacial sheet. Charlotte pushed open the creaking wooden door, carrying only a small leather bag and Duchess in her arms. The interior welcomed her with the smell of mold and abandonment. A single room with a peeling iron bed, a rough table, and a fireplace that seemed to have not known warmth for years. It was in that very same small space that her mother had taken refuge during the illness that preceded her death. Charlotte ran her fingers over the rough wall, imagining Eleanor Pemberton's delicate hands touching the same cold surface years earlier. The irony was bitter. The daughter was returning to her mother's exile, expelled from the same manor by rumors that destroyed reputations like pests ravaging crops. The first days dragged on like a funeral procession. The oil lamp offered a weak light that danced on the walls, creating shadows that seemed to whisper sad stories. Charlotte discovered a pile of forgotten books under the bed, volumes of Shelley and Wordsworth, with pages yellowed by time. At night, when the cold bit harder, she read aloud to Duchess, her voice echoing in the solitude like a prayer in an empty cathedral. "My Lady Charlotte." The familiar voice of Marta, the cook, arrived one morning along with the aroma of fresh bread. The robust woman appeared on the doorstep, her arms laden with baskets covered with embroidered cloths. "I've brought you some things." Charlotte rose from the chair where she was mending a dress, her hands pausing in their movement. The unexpected kindness left her vulnerable to the tears she had been holding back since her arrival. "Marta, you shouldn't. Lady Beatrice doesn't need to know everything." The cook's gentle eyes shone with maternal determination. "And Miss Davies sent this." She extended a small package. "She said they're your favorite sheet music." Inside the brown paper, Charlotte found the music she used to play on the manor's piano. Chopin, Mozart, melodies she could now only perform in her memory. Her hands trembled as she held the familiar pages. "How is the house?" "Too quiet." Marta arranged the supplies on the table: cheese, dried fruit, a small jar of honey. "The piano doesn't play anymore. Lord Blackwood hasn't appeared since everything happened. And Lady Beatrice walks the corridors like a ghost searching for peace." The weeks succeeded one another in a ritual of survival. Charlotte woke with the birdsong, fed Duchess with the scraps she could get, and dedicated her mornings to creating a small garden in the vicinity of the cottage. With her hands in the cold earth, she planted seedlings that Marta brought her secretly, transforming her exile into an act of silent resistance. In the afternoons, she walked the property's forgotten trails with Duchess frolicking at her side, observing how nature remained beautiful regardless of human injustices. The bare trees held promises of spring. The frost-covered fields whispered of inevitable rebirths. It was during one of these walks, when February began to show timid signs that winter wouldn't last forever, that Charlotte spotted a familiar figure mounted on a black stallion. Captain William Ashworth was riding along the main road, his silhouette outlined against the grey sky like a portrait, emerging from distant memories. He had returned from the Crimean War. Charlotte hid behind an old oak tree, her heart fluttering like a frightened hummingbird. Duchess sniffed the air, recognizing a familiar scent, but a gentle whisper from the young woman made her stay quiet. William looked different. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jawline told stories of battles he would never recount. His shoulders were broader, his posture straighter, but there was something in his eyes, a new depth, as if he had seen so much of the world's darkness that he was now desperately seeking the light. Had he also heard the rumors? The question tormented Charlotte as she watched him continue toward the manor. Had his opinion of me changed, like everyone else's? The answer would come sooner than she imagined, along with revelations that would transform not only her own destiny, but the very fabric of the truth that had been so cruelly twisted by anonymous hands and envious hearts. The wind carried the aroma of damp earth and promises of spring when Charlotte heard firm footsteps approaching the cottage. Duchess perked up her ears, her tail thumping against the wooden floor like a drum announcing a visitor. It was late at night, and the lamp projected golden circles that trembled on the walls like nervous breaths. The knock on the door came softly, almost hesitantly. Unlike the military authority Charlotte expected from a captain, she smoothed her simple grey wool dress, pulled the shawl over her shoulders, and opened the door with her heart leaping like a caged bird. William Ashworth stood there, even more imposing than in her memory. His uniform had been swapped for civilian clothes, a dark coat, a discreet tie, but the military posture remained. The scar on his face didn't diminish his beauty. On the contrary, it added gravity to features that had always been noble. His grey eyes, once bright with carefree youth, now held shadows that spoke of losses that scar the soul forever. "Charlotte," His voice was deeper, laden with experiences that had transformed the boy who had left into the man who had returned. "May I come in?" She nodded, stepping aside to let him pass. The modest interior of the cottage seemed to shrink even more with his presence. William looked around. The stacked books, the carefully organized sheet music, the small vase with wildflowers she had gathered that morning. "I received a letter while I was still in Portsmouth." He spoke without preamble, his hands clasped behind his back, like a soldier at attention, telling me about the events here. Charlotte felt a blush rise to her cheeks like a high tide. "So you came to find out the truth?" The firmness in his voice made her look up to meet his eyes. "I've known you since you were a child, Charlotte. I remember the girl who found injured birds and nursed them until they were strong enough to fly again, who read to the staff's children when they were sick, who cried for 3 days when the old horse in the stable died of old age." He stepped closer, and Charlotte realized how the war had changed not only his appearance but his very essence. There was a stillness about him, a depth that hadn't existed before. That girl would not have turned into a woman capable of the things they accuse you of. "People change, William." Her voice came out as a wounded whisper. "And I am no longer the child you knew." "No, you're not." He studied her face with an intensity that made her feel naked, exposed. "You are stronger now, more resilient. Exile has forged something in you that comfort never could." Duchess approached William, sniffing his boots with cautious curiosity. He knelt to stroke the animal's golden head, a smile touching the corners of his mouth, the first Charlotte had seen since his return. "She has remained loyal to you. Animals sense things that humans refuse to see. Why do you believe me when everyone else—" "Because I lost my younger brother in Crimea." The confession came out low, laden with a pain that no amount of time would completely heal. James was only 20. He died of a fever in a campaign tent, whispering the name of the fiancée who was waiting for him at home. And I learned that life is too short to waste on hasty judgments and unquestioned truths. The silence that followed was filled only by the crackling of the logs in the fireplace and Duchess's soft breathing. Charlotte felt something stir in her chest. Not hope yet, but perhaps the possibility of hope. "What do you intend to do?" "Find who wrote that letter. Discover why someone wanted to destroy your reputation." His grey eyes hardened like tempered steel. "And when I find that person, they will answer not only to you but to me." "And what if you discover the rumors are true?" William rose slowly, his height making her tilt her head back. For a moment, she thought he would touch her face, but his hands remained still at his sides. "Then I will apologize for doubting you and go on with my life. But Charlotte—" He paused, as if weighing each word. "I returned from the war knowing how to recognize truth when I see it. And when I look at you, I see only a woman who was wronged by someone too cowardly to sign their own name." He walked to the door, then turned one last time. "Don't let this situation break your spirit. The storm is passing, and when it has passed completely, I want you to be whole to see the sun that will come afterward." And with those words, William Ashworth left, leaving Charlotte with something she hadn't felt in months, the possibility that perhaps, just perhaps, truth still had power in this world of appearances and hasty judgments. The next morning brought a different energy to the air. Charlotte awoke feeling as if something fundamental had changed during the night, not in the external circumstances of her exile, but in the quality of the hope that now dared to sprout in her heart. Duchess seemed to feel it too. The dog frolicked in the small garden with more liveliness than she had shown in weeks. William had begun his investigation even before the sun had fully risen. His first stop was the property of Henry Blackwood, a Georgian mansion surrounded by formal gardens, where every shrub was pruned with military precision. He found the young Viscount in the stable, examining an Arabian stallion he had recently acquired. "Ashworth." Henry turned with a cautious expression. At 24, he possessed the easy beauty of young aristocrats. Blonde hair, blue eyes, regular features that had never been tested by real adversity. "I heard you'd returned. I want to see the letter." The direct statement made Henry flinch imperceptibly. "What letter?" "The one that ended your engagement to Charlotte Pemberton." "I see no reason to—" Henry began, but the expression on William's face made him reconsider. The captain was no longer the carefree young man who had left for war. There was something dangerous in his stillness, an authority that came from having commanded men in life-or-death situations. "The letter is with Lady Beatrice. She only showed it to me to explain why the engagement couldn't continue." "Describe what you saw." Henry averted his gaze, clearly uncomfortable. "Common paper, black ink, feminine handwriting, signed only as a concerned witness." "Feminine handwriting." William repeated thoughtfully. Did you recognize the hand? No, I didn't. But there was something in Henry's hesitation that suggested otherwise. William pressed on. Are you sure? Perhaps something familiar in the strokes, in the slant of the letters. Perhaps. Henry ran a hand through his hair in a nervous gesture. It might resemble something from my cousin Isabella's correspondence, but Isabella Whitmore? Yes, but that's impossible. Isabella is always in our home. She's practically family. Why would she do something like that? Why, indeed? William filed the question away as he headed to his next stop. The answer, he suspected, would be intertwined with jealousy and unrequited passions that fermented in the drawing rooms of Bath society like wine turning sour in a poorly kept cellar. Thornfield Manor received him with its imposing facade, but William noticed signs of neglect that hadn't existed before his departure. Less well-tended gardens, windows that needed cleaning, a general air of melancholy that emanated from the very stones. Miss Davies met him at the door, her intelligent eyes shining with what looked like relief. Captain Ashworth, we were expecting your visit. We were. Martha and I. We knew that when you returned, you wouldn't accept things as they are. The governess led him through corridors that echoed like empty cathedrals. Lady Beatrice is in the pink parlour. Lady Beatrice looked up from her correspondence when William entered. The woman seemed to have aged years in a few months, the lines around her eyes deeper, her posture less rigid. It was as if the certainty that had always characterized her had fragmented, leaving her more human, more vulnerable. William, I imagined you would come to question me about Charlotte. I would like to see the letter. Without arguing, Lady Beatrice opened a desk drawer and handed him the paper that had changed so many destinies. William examined it carefully, paper of medium quality, available at any stationery store in Bath. The handwriting was, in fact, feminine, with elaborate flourishes that suggested a refined education. May I compare it with other correspondence? Lady Beatrice hesitated. For what purpose? To find out who wrote this. His voice carried an authority that admitted no questioning. Someone deliberately destroyed an innocent young woman's reputation. That person needs to answer for their actions. It was then that Miss Davies appeared on the doorstep, carrying a tea tray that was clearly a pretext for her presence. Lady Beatrice, if you'll permit me. The governess set down the tray and turned to William. On the day mentioned in the letter, I accompanied Miss Charlotte to the gardens. She spoke briefly with Thomas about the rose bushes he was preparing for winter. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, and I was present the entire time. The silence that followed was as thick as morning fog. Lady Beatrice paled visibly. Why didn't you say this before? Because you didn't ask. Miss Davies lifted her chin with quiet dignity. You assumed the letter told the truth and acted on that assumption. William folded the letter carefully and put it in his coat pocket. With your permission, I would like to make some additional checks. And as he left Thornfield Manor, William already suspected that the truth, when finally revealed, would be more sordid and less noble than anyone had imagined. The human heart, he had discovered in war, was capable of cruelties that rivaled any battlefield. William's study at the property he had inherited from his father had been transformed into an improvised investigation room. Spread out on the mahogany desk were letters from various women in Bath society, correspondence he had discreetly requested under social pretexts. In the light of the oil lamp, each handwriting revealed a distinct personality, some hurried, others meticulous, all bearing the unique mannerisms of their authors. Duchess was curled up at Charlotte's feet, and she watched William work with growing admiration. He had asked her to come to witness the moment of discovery, wanting her to be the first to see her innocence irrefutably proven. Here, William placed a letter next to the anonymous note. Isabella Whitmore's correspondence from last month, requesting changes to the floral arrangement for the spring ball. Charlotte leaned in to observe, her shoulder almost touching his. The proximity made William waver for a moment. She smelled of lavender and the rain that had fallen that afternoon, a fragrance that seemed to carry promises of gardens blooming after storms. The letters R and E, Charlotte whispered, pointing with a delicate finger. The slant is identical. And look at the flourishes at the end of the words. William traced the similarities with the tip of a quill. Isabella has a habit of adding exaggerated curves when she ends a line. It's practically a signature. The evidence was undeniable. The anonymous letter had come from the quill of Isabella Whitmore, Henry Blackwood's cousin, and a constant presence in the high society salons of Bath. But why? Charlotte leaned back in the chair, confusion evident in her green eyes. What reason would she have to do something so cruel? William folded the letters carefully, his jaw tense with controlled anger. During his investigations, he had discovered more than just the authorship of the defamatory correspondence. Isabella has harbored feelings for Henry for years. She hoped that when he reached the appropriate age, a marriage between them would be naturally arranged. After all, they are cousins, and their properties would complement each other well. And my engagement to him ruined those plans. More than that. William stood up, walking to the window where the rain was beginning to drum against the glass. I spoke discreetly with some people. Isabella never reconciled herself to the fact that Henry chose you instead of accepting a family arrangement. She saw you as an intruder who usurped a place she considered hers by right. Charlotte felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold of the night. The idea of having been the target of such calculated hatred, of having her life destroyed by jealousy and ambition, was more bitter than any blind injustice. What will we do now? Now she faces the consequences. William's voice carried an implacable determination. Tomorrow I will present the evidence to the Social Council of Honor. Lady Pemberton will be publicly exonerated, and Isabella Whitmore will answer for defamation and slander. And Henry? William turned to face her, something dangerous shining in his grey eyes. Henry showed his true nature when he abandoned you without question or investigation. Men like that don't deserve second chances. The silence that followed was filled only by the sound of rain and the gentle crackling of the fireplace. Charlotte watched William in the window's backlight, the strong silhouette, the military posture, the scar that told stories of courage and sacrifice. This man had returned from war and, instead of seeking comfort and rest, had chosen to fight for her honor when everyone else had abandoned it. William, her voice came out lower than she intended. Why did you do all this? Why did you care so much? He turned slowly, and for a moment, Charlotte saw something in his eyes that made her heart race. But when he spoke, his voice maintained the careful formality that had characterized all their interactions. Because justice must mean something, Charlotte. Because I saw too much cruelty in war to tolerate more in peacetime. But there was something unsaid in his words, an undercurrent of emotion that he carefully held in check. Charlotte didn't dare to name it, but kept that moment in her heart, like a precious jewel. The possibility that perhaps when the storm of scandal and revelations had passed completely, something beautiful could blossom between them. The next morning, Isabella Whitmore would be confronted with her lies, and Bath society would discover that appearances do not always reflect reality. But for Charlotte, the true revelation had already happened. She had found someone willing to fight for her, even when she herself had lost the strength to fight for herself. The ballroom of the Bath Social Club had never witnessed such a tense meeting. The burgundy velvet chairs were arranged in a semicircle, occupied by the most prominent members of the local society. Lady Margaret Fitzwilliam, the council's lifetime president, presided over the session with a gravity that made the occasion feel like a supreme court. Charlotte entered the hall with Duchess at her side, wearing the navy blue dress that Miss Davies had secretly obtained from the mansion, the same color that always enhanced her green eyes and now lent solemnity to the moment. Her posture was erect, dignified, as if the months of exile had forged something unbreakable in her spine. William was already present, uniformed as a captain, his military decorations shining like stars against the dark fabric. Before him, on an oak table, was the evidence that would forever change society's perception of the recent events. Isabella Whitmore occupied an isolated chair, her face pale in contrast to the green dress she had chosen in the hope of projecting innocence. Her hands trembled imperceptibly on the silk fan she held like a useless shield. Captain Ashworth has requested this meeting to present evidence relevant to the case of Miss Charlotte Pemberton. Lady Fitzwilliam spoke in a voice that echoed on the silk-lined walls. Captain, you may proceed. William stood, his military authority evident in every movement. With surgical precision, he presented the handwriting comparison, the inconsistencies in Isabella's story, the testimony of Miss Davies about the true events of that winter day. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice carried the weight of irrefutable truth, Miss Pemberton was the victim of a deliberate campaign of defamation orchestrated by someone we trusted and to whom we opened our homes. The moment of revelation came when William placed the anonymous letter and a recent piece of Isabella's correspondence side by side. The silence in the hall was so dense you could hear the collective breathing of those present. The evidence is incontestable. Miss Isabella Whitmore forged the accusation against Miss Pemberton, motivated by personal jealousy and frustrated matrimonial ambition. Isabella rose abruptly, her fan falling to the floor with a noise that echoed like a scream. Her blue eyes shone with tears that could have been of remorse or simply of humiliation at being discovered. I never intended it to go this far." Her voice came out strangled, breaking the formality of the environment. "When I wrote that letter, I only thought about it protecting Henry from an inappropriate marriage." "Inappropriate?" Charlotte spoke for the first time, her voice firm, but without rancor. "You destroyed my reputation, my life, my future, to protect a man who was never truly yours. You didn't understand." Isabella turned to her with a desperation that seemed sincere. "Henry and I grew up together. Our families always expected. You appeared out of nowhere and took what should have been mine by right." "Love is not property, Isabella." Charlotte's response came gently, almost compassionately. "It is not something you possess by birthright or family arrangement." Lady Fitzwilliam tapped the small gavel on the table, restoring order. "In light of this evidence, this council declares Miss Charlotte Pemberton completely exonerated of all accusations. Miss Isabella Whitmore will be socially exiled until further notice, and her actions will be communicated to the respectable families of Bath as a warning." The verdict fell like an axe, definitively dividing what came before and what came after. Isabella left the hall without looking back, carrying the weight of a dishonor that would follow her like a perpetual shadow. But Charlotte barely noticed the departure of the woman who had caused so much suffering. Her eyes were fixed on William, who was watching her with an expression too intense to be merely professional. When he approached, she saw something in those grey eyes that made her heart dance like a candle flame in a gentle breeze. "It's over," he said simply. "Yes," she whispered. "It's over." But while the formal words marked the end of a nightmare, both knew that something completely new was just beginning, something that had grown quietly during the investigation, fueled by his courage and her dignity, and which now begged to be acknowledged in the light of day. Spring arrived in Bath like a pardon after a long winter of penance. The city's gardens awakened in a burst of colour that dramatically contrasted with the grey months Charlotte had spent in exile. She walked the main streets for the first time since her social redemption, Duchess trotting at her side, with the evident joy of being back on familiar ground. The invitation had arrived on a golden April morning, cream paper, a decisive masculine hand, sealed with the blue wax of the Ashworth family. William requested her presence for a walk in the Cotswolds, claiming to have something important to show her. The formality of the invitation contrasted with the intimacy that had developed between them during the weeks of investigation. The meeting was set for the bridge over the River Avon, where weeping willows touched the water with tender green fingers. Charlotte arrived wearing a new dress, a gift from Miss Davies, who had insisted she needed something that reflected the new beginning of her life. The lavender-coloured fabric rippled in the breeze like a promise of the coming summer. William was already waiting, leaning on the stone parapet, watching the water flow with a thoughtful expression. He had swapped his military uniform for elegant civilian clothes, a dark wool coat, a discreet tie, but his posture continued to betray years of military discipline. When he saw her approaching, something in his face softened in a way that made Charlotte feel butterflies dancing in her stomach. "You came." He straightened up, and for a moment he seemed almost nervous, a surprising vulnerability in such a commanding man. "Did you doubt I would? After everything you've been through, I thought you might prefer to avoid more complications." The word hung between them, laden with unspoken meanings. Charlotte studied his face, noticing how the scar actually enhanced the strength of his features, how his grey eyes seemed capable of seeing through appearances to the essence of things. "William, our friendship was never a complication." "Friendship." He repeated the word as if testing its flavour. "Is that what we have?" The question was asked gently, but carried a weight that made Charlotte realize they had reached a decisive moment. She could maintain the safety of social formality or take the courageous step toward unknown territory. I'm not sure what we have." The honesty came out harder than she expected. "I only know that you brought me back to life when I had given up the fight, that you saw me when everyone else looked through me as if I were a ghost." William approached slowly, as if he feared a sudden movement would make her disappear. "May I show you something?" They walked to the carriage that was waiting for them, and during the journey through the rolling Cotswolds landscape, Charlotte noticed how William seemed both determined and apprehensive. The conversation flowed naturally. He told stories of the war that weren't about battles, but about solidarity between soldiers, about letters from home that arrived like blessings, about small moments of beauty found in the most unlikely places. The cottage appeared on top of a gentle hill, surrounded by green fields that stretched to the horizon. It was a honey-colored stone house, with wild gardens where old roses grew in fragrant profusion. A small stable completed the property, and Charlotte could see horses grazing peacefully in the adjacent pasture. "It's beautiful," she murmured, stepping out of the carriage. Duchess immediately began exploring the gardens, delightedly sniffing the new aromas. "I bought it last week." William remained at her side, watching her reaction carefully. "I thought that after so much time in mansions and formal properties, you might appreciate something simpler, truer." Charlotte turned to face him, her heart beating like a bird wanting to take flight. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because I'm offering you a choice." His voice came out lower, laden with emotion he no longer tried to hide. "You can return to Bath society, be courted by appropriate men, rebuild the life that was taken from you. Or you can build something completely new with me. Not as captain and lady, but as two human beings who discovered that sometimes the best things grow in soil that has been plowed by adversity." The proposal hung between them like a bridge over an abyss, a passage to a possible happiness, but one that required courage to cross. And Charlotte understood that her answer would define not only her future, but the type of woman she had become during the months of exile and discovery. 16 years had passed like gentle seasons in a well-composed symphony. Charlotte adjusted the wool shawl over her shoulders as she watched her children in the garden through the kitchen window. Eleanor at 15 had inherited her father's elegant height and her mother's penetrating green eyes, but she possessed a determination that was entirely her own. At that moment, she was teaching James, 13, to ride the young horse William had bought last autumn. The cottage had transformed over the years into a home that breathed genuine happiness. The stone walls were now covered by ivy that William had planted as a gift on their first wedding anniversary, and Charlotte's gardens had expanded to include not only flowers, but a productive vegetable patch that fed both the family and needy neighbors. "Mama, look!" The high-pitched voice of Rose, the 8-year-old youngest, came from the garden. The girl had built an elaborate dollhouse under the old oak tree, with tiny furniture made of twigs and flowers. She possessed her mother's wild imagination and her father's practicality, a combination that resulted in surprisingly applied creativity. Charlotte smiled, drying her hands on her apron. Life in the Cotswolds had proved richer than any existence she could have imagined in the gilded salons of Bath. Here, she taught music and literature to the daughters of local farmers twice a week, in an improvised school she had set up in the converted barn. The children arrived with faces rosy from the wind and eyes hungry for knowledge, and Charlotte had discovered that teaching was one of the purest joys of her existence. The sound of hooves on the gravel road announced William's return from his trip to London. As a member of Parliament representing the region, he spent part of the year in the capital, fighting for legislation that would benefit rural communities. But he always returned to the cottage like a thirsty traveller returning to an oasis. "Papa!" Rose abandoned her dollhouse and ran toward the carriage, followed by Duchess, now a senior dog with silver fur, but still devoted to the family. Eleanor and James interrupted their riding lesson to greet their father. Charlotte watched from the doorstep as William hugged each child individually, asking about their studies, their projects, their dreams. At 44, he had become even more attractive. Maturity had softened his military angles, and domestic happiness had lent warmth to his grey eyes, which had once been too somber. "And how is my favourite wife?" he approached, and even after all these years, Charlotte's heart sped up when he pulled her into a hug that smelled of leather, tobacco, and the cologne she herself had chosen for him. "Your only wife, I hope." She laughed against his chest, feeling the vibration of his laughter in response. Always the smartest in the family. That night, after the children had fallen asleep and Duchess was curled up in front of the fireplace, Charlotte and William sat on the porch watching the stars shine without competition from city lights. The silence between them was comfortable, woven from years of mutual understanding. "I received an interesting letter in London," William murmured, intertwining his fingers with hers. "Lady Beatrice passed away last week." Charlotte felt a pang of sadness that surprised her. Despite everything, her sister-in-law had been an important part of her formation. "Did she leave anything?" "The cottage where you were exiled. It's in your name now, with a letter asking for forgiveness for the lost years." The irony was touching. The place of her greatest humiliation had become a posthumous gift of reconciliation. Charlotte imagined the proud woman dictating those final words, finally admitting the mistake she had never corrected in life. And Isabella? She never married. She lives reclusively on the family property in Yorkshire, taking care of her elderly mother. Charlotte felt no satisfaction from the information. Time had healed not only her wounds, but also her resentment. Isabella had paid a high price for a moment of youthful jealousy and ambition. People make choices, William observed as if reading her thoughts, and they live with the consequences. We were lucky. Our choices brought us here. Here meant more than the cottage and the gardens. It meant a life built on a solid foundation of mutual respect, a love that had matured like fine wine, and children who grew up knowing only the security of a home where they were genuinely loved. It was, Charlotte knew, more than she had ever dared to dream of as a young orphan navigating the whims of Victorian society. The autumn of 1863 painted the Cotswolds in golden tones that rivaled the most beautiful paintings. Charlotte, now 35, watched through the window of the small school that had grown over the years. What had started as informal lessons in the barn had turned into a respected institution that attracted visitors from all over England, curious about the innovative educational methods applied there. 22 girls of various ages occupied the light wood desks, bent over creative writing exercises. Charlotte had discovered that when she encouraged the students to write about their own experiences, helping on the farms, taking care of younger siblings, observing the changes of the seasons, their compositions came to life in a way that never happened with artificially imposed topics. "Miss Thompson, can you read what you wrote about the apple harvest for us?" Charlotte addressed a 12-year-old girl whose brown eyes shone with lively intelligence. Mary Thompson stood up, her cheeks flushed with shy pride. "My composition is called My Grandmother's Hands." Her clear voice echoed through the room as she described how the wrinkled hands of the family matriarch seemed to hold all the wisdom in the world when they chose the sweetest apples for winter jam. Charlotte felt that deep satisfaction that came from knowing she was planting seeds in fertile ground. Many of her former students had become teachers. Some went on to universities that were finally beginning to accept women, and others found creative ways to apply their education in their communities. Eleanor, now 19, had become the school's unofficial assistant. She had inherited both her mother's love for education and her father's determination, but had added her own revolutionary twist. At that moment, she was leading a discussion about women's rights with the older group, her progressive ideas echoing the changes that were beginning to sweep Victorian society. "Mama," Eleanor approached when classes were over, "I received a letter from the University of London. They would like you to lecture on rural educational methods." Charlotte smiled, putting away the teaching materials she had developed over the years. The school's reputation had spread through correspondence from satisfied parents and impressed visitors, but she had never imagined it would reach the academic ears of London. "And what do you think? Should I accept?" "You must. Your ideas can influence many more girls if they are heard by educators from all over England." The conversation was interrupted by the familiar sound of hooves on the road. William was returning from his visit to the farmers in the region, where he had discussed the implementation of new agricultural techniques. James, now a 17-year-old as tall as his father, was riding beside him, both engaged in animated conversation about field irrigation. Rose, at 12, ran to greet them as she always did, but now she was carrying a manuscript she had been writing, a story about a princess who saved kingdoms not with magic, but with libraries and schools. The girl had inherited her mother's imagination, but had directed it toward narratives that questioned social conventions in a surprisingly sophisticated way. That night, gathered in the living room that had become the center of fascinating family discussions, Charlotte observed her children and husband with a gratitude that was sometimes painful in its intensity. Eleanor debated with her father about parliamentary representation for women. James showed technical drawings of improvements he wanted to implement on the property, and Rose read excerpts from her story to Duchess, who listened with infinite canine patience. "You're thoughtful tonight," William murmured when they were finally alone, the children having retired to their rooms. "I was thinking about legacies." Charlotte snuggled against him on the sofa in front of the fireplace. "About how what we've built here will continue after we're gone. Our children will carry forward everything they've learned. The girls you taught will do the same with their own daughters. The ideas we've planted will grow like seeds in the wind." Charlotte thought about it, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. She had started as a young orphan whose life was destroyed by an anonymous letter, had gone through exile and redemption, found true love, and now saw her children preparing to change the world in ways she could barely imagine. The legacy was not just in the children she had raised or the students she had educated, but in the living proof that dignity and love could triumph over cruelty and prejudice, that a life built on solid foundations could withstand any storm and flourish into lasting beauty. The letter arrived on a May morning when lilacs perfumed the Cotswolds air with promises of summer. Charlotte received it from the hands of the local postman, immediately recognizing the official seal of Bath. It had been years since she had received correspondence from the city that had once been her world, and for a moment she felt that old tension settling in her stomach. William found her in the kitchen, the letter still unopened in her hands, her gaze lost through the window where Rose was helping Eleanor prune the rose bushes. "Bad news?" He approached, placing his hand gently on her shoulder. "I don't know yet." Charlotte turned the letter over in her hands. "It's from the law firm Pemberton and Associates. It must be about Lady Beatrice's will. Do you want me to open it for you?" She shook her head, took a deep breath, and broke the seal. The cream-colored paper revealed a formal correspondence, but the first lines made her eyebrows arch in surprise. "William, they want me to return to Bath, not for legal matters, but for a ceremony." "What kind of ceremony?" Charlotte continued reading, her expression changing from confusion to something close to astonishment. "The Society of Bath Charitable Ladies wants to honor me for the educational work I've done here. They say my innovative methods have brought national recognition to the region, and they want to grant me the title of honorary patron." The silence that followed was filled only by the bird song and the distant laughter of her daughters in the garden. William studied his wife's face, trying to decipher the mix of emotions unfolding there. "How do you feel about this?" "Confused." Charlotte folded the letter carefully. 16 years ago, those same people exiled me based on unfounded rumors. Now they want to celebrate me for achievements I made far from them. People change. Society evolves, even if slowly. Or perhaps it's now convenient to associate themselves with something successful. There was a slight bitterness in her voice that surprised even herself. Eleanor entered at that moment, her hands dirty with soil, golden hair escaping from the practical braids she wore for working in the garden. At 19, she possessed a presence that commanded attention effortlessly, not through conventional beauty, though she was remarkably attractive, but through the intelligence that radiated like her own light. "Did something happen? You two look like you're having a serious conversation." Charlotte handed her the letter. Eleanor read it quickly, her green eyes so similar to her mother's growing brighter. "Mama, this is wonderful. You must accept." "Must? Why?" Eleanor pulled up a chair and sat next to her parents, her passion for just causes inflaming her voice. "Because you have the opportunity to return, not as the young woman who was wronged, but as the woman who turned that injustice into something productive. Imagine how many other women in similar situations can be inspired by your story." William nodded thoughtfully. "Eleanor is right. Your presence there would be a powerful statement that it's possible to overcome adversity and build something meaningful. And I would like to see Bath." Rose appeared at the door, clearly having overheard part of the conversation. At 12, she possessed an insatiable curiosity that made her absorb knowledge like a sponge absorbs water. "In the history books I've studied, Bath seems like a fascinating place." James, who was helping his father with parliamentary correspondence in the next room, joined the group. "If we all go together, it could be an interesting family adventure." Charlotte looked at the eager faces around the table, her husband offering silent support, Eleanor glowing with the fervor of someone who sees an opportunity for social justice, Rose vibrating with the possibility of a new experience, James practical but supportive. Duchess, now a 16-year-old canine lady, lifted her grey head as if also giving her opinion on the decision. "Very well." Charlotte finally smiled. "We will go to Bath, but not to seek approval from people who rejected me, but to show that a life well lived is the best answer to any injustice." The decision was made, but Charlotte could not imagine how the return to the city of her youth would reveal not only how much she had changed, but also how certain wounds of the past still needed a final touch of healing to scar over completely. The train crossed the rolling Somerset landscape like a serpent of iron and steam, carrying the Ashworths back to a past that Charlotte had left behind 16 years earlier. Sitting in the first-class compartment, a courtesy William had insisted on paying despite his wife's practical protests, she watched through the window as the familiar hills emerged from the morning mist. Bath appeared gradually like a city from a dream, its honey-colored stone buildings shining under the June sun like jewels carefully arranged in a velvet box. The Georgian buildings remained elegant, the crescents and terraces maintaining the architectural harmony that had made the city a model of urban planning. It's even more beautiful than I imagined. Rose pressed her nose against the glass, her brown eyes wide with admiration. Say, it looks like a setting from a storybook. Eleanor studied a city guide she had bought at the station, always meticulous in her preparation. It says here that Bath has more than 2,000 years of history. The Romans built baths here due to the natural hot springs. James, now a 17-year-old with his father's impressive height, observed the city's practical aspects. The engineering of the Roman aqueducts must have been remarkable for its time. Charlotte smiled at her children's varied reactions, but she felt a growing tension in her stomach as the train approached the station. Duchess, aged but still alert, remained quiet on her lap, as if she also sensed the emotional magnitude of the moment. William covered her hand with his. "Are you all right?" "Nervous," she admitted. "It's strange to return as a completely different person from the one who left." "You are the same person, Charlotte. You've just become more fully who you always were." Bath Station welcomed them with its characteristic movement, passengers getting off and on, vendors offering newspapers and flowers, porters moving luggage. But Charlotte noticed subtle differences. More women traveling alone, slightly less rigid clothing, a general sense that the world was changing, even if slowly. The hotel William had booked was in the heart of the city, a respectable inn with a view of Bath Abbey. The rooms were comfortable without being extravagant, and Charlotte appreciated the discretion of the choice. They didn't want to attract unnecessary attention to their arrival. "Mama, can I explore the hotel gardens?" Rose practically vibrated with contained excitement. "We can all explore a bit," Charlotte decided. "But let's stay together." The walk through the familiar streets proved to be a surreal experience. Charlotte recognized every corner, every facade, but she saw everything through eyes that had matured dramatically. The city that had once represented her entire world now seemed almost small, limited in ways she hadn't realized when she was young. They passed in front of Thornfield Manor, now with less well-kept gardens and the general appearance of a property that had changed hands. Eleanor asked about the history of the place, and Charlotte told her in a factual, unbittered way about the years she had spent there as an orphan dependent on family charity. "And that little house in the back?" Rose pointed to the cottage where Charlotte had spent months in exile. "That was my home for a while, where I learned that inner strength is more valuable than external approval." The most touching moment came when they visited the church where she and William had married. The stone building remained unchanged, its stained glass windows painting colored patterns on the nave floor. Charlotte touched the pew where she had sat as a nervous bride, remembering how her happiness that day had been tempered by uncertainty about the future. "Was this where you got married?" Eleanor asked in a soft voice. "It was, in a simple ceremony, with only Miss Davies and Martha as witnesses." "And you lived happily ever after?" Rose wanted to know, with the natural romanticization of a 12-year-old child. William and Charlotte exchanged glances, laden with years of mutual knowledge, shared tears, multiplied joys, and challenges overcome together. "We were happy most of the time," Charlotte answered honestly. "And when we weren't, we worked together until we were again." That night in the hotel room, while William read and the children rested in the adjacent rooms, Charlotte stood at the window, watching Bath in the moonlight. Tomorrow would be the ceremony, the moment to close a circle that had begun with humiliation and exile. But she already felt that, regardless of what happened, she had won the most important battle, the fight to remain true to herself. The ballroom of the assembly rooms had been decorated with floral arrangements that rivaled royal gardens. White roses and purple lilacs created fragrant cascades that transformed the space into something between a cathedral and a secret garden. Charlotte watched the preparations through a side window, her hands nervously smoothing the navy blue silk dress that Eleanor had convinced her to buy, especially for the occasion. "You look stunning, Mama." Eleanor adjusted the pearl necklace, William's wedding gift, on her mother's neck. "And more importantly, you look confident." "I'm trying to be." Charlotte smiled at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her had soft lines around her eyes that spoke of years of genuine smiles, a posture that radiated quiet dignity, and something in her green eyes that the 19-year-old who had left Bath did not possess, wisdom gained through adversity overcome. William appeared at the door, elegant in his dress uniform, his military decorations shining like stars against the dark fabric. "Are the ladies ready?" "The ceremony will begin in a few minutes." Rose and James joined them in the hallway, both impeccably dressed for the occasion. Rose wore a cream-colored dress that enhanced her brown hair, while James was formal in his first adult evening suit. "My family," Charlotte murmured, a wave of gratitude washing over her. "My strength," The main hall was packed, a curious mix of local aristocracy, educators from London, journalists interested in the story of personal and social transformation that Charlotte represented, and a few familiar faces from a past that seemed to belong to another life. Miss Davies, now a lady with completely white hair but still lively eyes, sat in the front row. Marta, retired but radiant, waved discreetly when Charlotte entered. Even Thomas, the former gardener whose existence had been distorted to create scandal, was present with his wife and children, now prospering as the owner of his own nursery. The opening speech was given by Lady Margaret Pemberton, a distant cousin who had taken over the leadership of the Society of Charitable Ladies. She spoke about social evolution, about recognizing merit wherever it flourishes, and about the courage to admit when past judgments have been hasty. When Charlotte was called to the stage, the silence in the hall was so dense you could hear the collective breathing of those present. She walked with firm steps, the dignity she had earned over the years enveloping her like an invisible cape. "Ladies and gentlemen," her clear voice echoed through the historic walls, "when I left Bath 16 years ago, I was broken, humiliated, convinced that my life had ended before it had truly begun." She paused, observing faces in the audience, some curious, others respectful, a few visibly uncomfortable with memories of how they had treated the young woman she had been. "Today I return not in search of vindication or apologies, but to share a lesson I have learned. Adversity can be the best teacher we will ever have if we choose to learn instead of becoming bitter." Charlotte talked about the school in the Cotswolds, about the girls who had become teachers, nurses, writers. She spoke about raising children to question injustices instead of perpetuating them. She described how true love, both romantic and familial, could blossom in the most improbable circumstances. "If my story can inspire a young woman not to give up when the world judges her unfairly, then every moment of pain was worth it." The applause that followed was more than social courtesy. It was genuine recognition of courage and transformation. But the most touching moment came when a young woman in the audience stood up. "Miss Charlotte." "Lady Ashworth," she corrected herself. "My name is Sarah Mitchell. I am a teacher at a school for working girls in Manchester. I learned about your methods through an article in the London Educational Journal, and they have completely transformed my approach to teaching." The young woman continued, describing how Charlotte's techniques had been adapted for urban contexts, helping girls from working-class families discover their own voices through writing and literature. At that moment, Charlotte understood that her story had transcended personal revenge or social recognition. It had become a seed of change that was germinating in places she couldn't even imagine, touching lives she would never know. The reception after the ceremony took place in an atmosphere of controlled elegance when Charlotte saw her. Isabella Whitmore was in the farthest corner of the hall, partially hidden behind a marble column, watching the proceedings with an unreadable expression. At 38, she was still beautiful, but there was something dispirited in her posture, a resignation that spoke of years lived on the margins of the society that had once celebrated her. Charlotte felt William tense beside her when he also noticed the presence of the woman who had orchestrated her downfall 16 years earlier. "She shouldn't be here." His voice carried an instinctive protectiveness. "Perhaps she has as much right as anyone else." Charlotte was surprised by her own response. After all, she is also part of this story. Eleanor, who had noticed the tension between her parents, followed their gazes and immediately understood who the solitary woman was. "Is that her? The one who wrote the letter?" "It is. What do you want to do?" Charlotte observed Isabella for a long moment. The woman seemed smaller than in her memory, diminished not only by the years but by the weight of actions that had probably tormented her since they were discovered. "I'm going to talk to her." "Charlotte," William began. "It's all right. Some conversations need to happen." She walked through the hall, briefly greeting acquaintances who approached to congratulate her, but keeping her focus on her destination. Isabella saw her approaching, and for a moment seemed to want to flee, but she remained in place like a cornered animal that finally stops running. "Isabella, Charlotte." The response came almost in a whisper. "You are radiant. Happiness becomes you. Thank you." Charlotte studied the face of the woman who had been her antagonist. There were lines of sadness that hadn't existed before, a melancholy that suggested years of self-imposed solitude. "How have you been?" "Surviving." Isabella nervously touched the simple necklace she wore, a modest piece compared to the elaborate jewelry she used to display. "Taking care of my mother, managing the family property, a quiet life." "And has it been enough?" The question seemed to hit Isabella like a precise arrow. Her eyes filled with tears she fought to contain. "No, it has never been enough, but it's what I deserve after what I did." Charlotte felt an unexpected wave of compassion. Here was a woman who had been consumed by jealousy and ambition, who had made a cruel decision in a moment of desperation, and who had spent the following years punishing herself in ways that society could never equal. "Isabella, may I ask why did you come today?" "Because I needed to see you triumph." The confession came out haltingly. "I needed to know that my cruelty didn't destroy you, that you managed to build something beautiful despite me. And also," Isabella hesitated, then continued in a broken voice, "and because I wanted to apologize. Not to redeem myself, I know there is no redemption for what I did, but because you deserve to hear that I acknowledge the evil of my actions." The silence that followed was filled by the soft music of the orchestra and the distant murmur of conversations. Charlotte could feel the curious glances of other guests, but at that moment, all that mattered was her and the woman who had been simultaneously her destroyer and, inadvertently, the architect of her true happiness. "I accept your apology, Isabella, not because you deserve it, but because I deserve the peace that comes with forgiveness." Isabella closed her eyes, as if the words were a blessing she had waited for years. "You were always a better person than me." She opened her eyes and Charlotte saw in them something that approached gratitude. "Henry never deserved you. In fact, none of us deserve to know someone like you. We all deserve second chances, Isabella. The question is whether we have the courage to take them." Isabella nodded slowly, then moved away from the column. "I will leave now. I just wanted to thank you, Charlotte. Thank you for showing me that it's possible to be greater than our worst moments." And with those words, Isabella Whitmore left the hall and Charlotte's life forever, carrying with her the forgiveness that would finally free her to build some kind of peace, even if it was a late one. The late afternoon sun gilded the hotel gardens as the Ashworth family gathered on the private terrace of their suite. Bath stretched out before them like a map of memories, its honey-colored stone buildings bathed in the soft light that transformed the city into a watercolor of pastel shades. Charlotte leaned back in the wicker chair, watching her children process the day's events. Eleanor leafed through a notebook where she had jotted down observations about the people she had met, always analyzing social structures and possibilities for reform. James examined a map of Bath, interested in the city's architectural and engineering aspects. Rose drew in her sketchbook, capturing the view from the window, with details that revealed a keen artistic eye. "It's been quite a day," William murmured, pouring tea from a tray the hotel had sent. Duchess was dozing at Charlotte's feet, exhausted from the social excitement, but visibly content to be surrounded by her family. "Mama," Rose looked up from her drawing, "how do you feel now that it's all over? Complete?" The answer came without hesitation, as if a circle that began a long time ago has finally closed. Eleanor put her notebook aside. "What do you think would have happened if Isabella had never written that letter?" "I probably would have married Henry, lived a comfortable but superficial life in Bath, maybe had children who would grow up accepting privileges without question." Charlotte smiled. "I would never have truly known your father, never would have discovered my passion for teaching, wouldn't have learned that inner strength is more valuable than social approval." "So, in a way, Isabella did you a favor," James observed with the practical logic he had inherited from his father. "In a way, yes, although I doubt that's how she sees the situation." William leaned forward, his grey eyes reflective. "Sometimes I think our greatest enemies end up being our most effective teachers. They force us to discover resources we didn't even know we possessed." "And our greatest loves?" Rose asked, with the romantic curiosity of her 12 years. Charlotte and William exchanged glances, laden with the intimacy built over 16 years of marriage. "Our greatest loves teach us who we really are when all the masks fall off," Charlotte replied. "They love us not despite our flaws, but including them." The conversation was interrupted by a gentle knock on the door. William went to answer and returned with Miss Davies, now an 80-year-old lady, but still possessing the dignity that had always characterized her. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, but her eyes shone with genuine satisfaction. "I just wanted to say goodbye before you leave tomorrow." "Miss Davies." Charlotte stood up to hug the woman who had been her only ally during the darkest months. "Thank you for coming today. Your presence meant more than you can imagine." "Nonsense, my dear. I wouldn't have missed for the world the opportunity to see you receive the recognition you always deserved." Miss Davies accepted a cup of tea and settled into a chair, observing the reunited family with eyes that had witnessed decades of social changes. "You know," she began, "when Charlotte was in the staff cottage, I used to visit her on the coldest nights. She never complained, never expressed bitterness. Instead, she talked about the books she was reading, the flowers she planned to plant in the spring, the letters she wrote to keep her sanity." "What kind of letters?" Eleanor asked. "Letters to herself in the future. She wrote about the woman she hoped to become, about the life she would build when she got out of that situation. It was those letters that convinced me that she would not only survive, but flourish." Charlotte felt tears prick her eyes. She had completely forgotten about those letters, exercises in hope written in the light of a lamp on nights that seemed to have no end. "I still have some of them," Miss Davies continued, taking a yellowed envelope from her purse. "I saved them all these years, thinking that maybe one day you would like to reread them." With slightly trembling hands, Charlotte opened the envelope and unfolded a sheet of common paper. Her own handwriting from 16 years earlier greeted her. "Dear Charlotte of the future, today the wind howled through the cracks in the cottage all night, but in the morning the first wildflowers appeared in my small garden. I hope that when you read this, you have learned that beauty can grow in the most unlikely places, that dignity is something no one can take from us, and that true love is worth any weight." The silence that followed was dense with emotion. Charlotte folded the letter carefully, holding it close to her heart. "I did it," she whispered. "I managed to become the woman I dreamed of being on those dark nights." William held her hand, intertwining their fingers. "You became much more than that." As the sun set over Bath, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Charlotte understood that her journey had been completed in a way more perfect than she had ever dared to imagine. She had returned not as a victim seeking reparation, but as an accomplished woman offering inspiration. She had found not only personal redemption, but the opportunity to positively influence other lives. And when the last light of day disappeared on the horizon, Charlotte Ashworth, formerly Pemberton, formerly an exile, formerly broken, rose as the complete woman she was always destined to be, surrounded by the love she had won and the family she had created, living proof that sometimes our happiest endings begin exactly where our nightmares seem to end.